Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the internal and external challenges that early modern empires faced in their tenure as governors of large multi-ethnic empires. Although many early modern land-based empires, like the Ottoman, Russian, Mughal, Qing, and Safavid empires, and early modern maritime-based empires like the Spanish, English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch empires, built and maintained empires that reaped the economic benefits of the land, resources, and to peoples they exploited, those empires were not void of challenges to their reign. As the imperial order of the early modern period solidified, individuals and groups of people who refused to accept the dominance of the new elites in these early modern empires took action against those empires. Those actions challenged the longevity of those early modern empires, and in time may have been the catalyst for great change in the late modern period of world history. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of this learning objective: to explain the effects of the development of state power from 1450 to 1750. In the early modern period, such large and enduring land-based empires and maritime empires led to a greater degree of state expansion and centralization than experienced in previous time periods in world history. As land-based empires of Afro-Eurasia came to dominate and maintain control over vast continuous continental territories that hosted vastly diverse populations, the practice of greater political centrality occurred in places like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Qing Empire, and the Russian Empire. Likewise, as maritime empires came to dominate American and Afro-Eurasian territories that hosted vastly diverse populations, increasing degrees of political centrality was a necessity of the political elites in places like the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, the English Empire, and the French Empire. With greater political centralization came an array of responses to that centralization. Not all peoples welcomed foreign empires in and near their territories. Not all peoples sought to be subjected to foreign empire. Not all subject peoples remained idle and conforming to imperial centrality. Not all subject peoples believed that early modern empires had their best interests. In effect, threatened peoples and subject peoples alike resisted imperial expansion and political centrality. In Europe, during this age of exploration and expansion, great maritime empires came to control diverse populations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Although many American, African, and Asian peoples came under greater European political and economic control, the increased levels of political centrality of European states played out onto European populations as well. Much like in American, African, and Asian societies, where Europeans gained political and economic upper hands, European populations came under unprecedented political control. Religious division from the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the emergence of 15th and 16th century new monarchs, the development of the divine right of state, and the emergence of 16th and 17th century absolute monarchs subjected ethnic and religious minorities and entire social classes of people to a level of political centrality unseen since the time of the Roman Empire. One location where greater political centrality was exhibited was in the Stuart monarchy in post-Elizabethan England. James and Charles Stuart, the first two monarchs of the 17th century in England, believed they had divine right to rule over England with an absolutist iron fist. As devout Catholics, they also viewed Anglicans and Puritans as their religious and political enemies. Of course, James and Charles would act on those views and created an England in which Puritans, separatists, and disloyal Anglicans would head for greener pastures in places more accepting of their Protestant ways. In some cases, this religious and political persecution took them to the Dutch Netherlands, who had recently gained their independence from Catholic Spain earlier in the late 16th century. In other cases, this religious and political persecution took them to the newly developing North American colonies. However, not all non-Catholics were removed from England, as some of them held titles of nobility and seats in Parliament, England's body politic that traditionally enacted laws and loyally served the English crown. By the time of Charles I's reign, Parliament was a misused and abused body politic, typically used merely for the raising of taxes, so Charles could enact militant violence on other political and religious enemies in and out of England. Eventually, members of Parliament called for reforms in the King's treatment of Parliament, but all that got them was a decade-long dissolution in which England existed without a Parliament. Eventually, under the direction of Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, soldier, and former member of Parliament, a pro-parliamentary army known as the Roundheads convened and challenged the Cavalier army of King Charles I. Over the course of the 1640s, the Roundheads would defeat the Cavaliers, and King Charles I would be beheaded, and England would exist for an entire decade without a monarch. In 17th century France, an entire class of French nobles and political elites bared witness to the ever-increasing political centrality of the Bourbon dynasty in France. France, having just exited the 30 Years' War, the most destructive war in European history prior to World War I, and having been on the winning side of the 30 Years' War, existed in a vulnerable state of financial failure. King Louis XIII had passed away in 1643, with 5 years remaining in the 30 Years' War. Louis's wife, Anne of Austria, would serve as regent of France, while her son, eventually Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a child. Her primary advisor was Cardinal Mazarin, who sought to raise taxes on the French aristocracy and noble elites in order to pay off debt from the 30 Years' War. At first, these new taxes spawned a revolt by members of the French judiciary, known as the First Fronde. However, Anne and Mazarin easily put down the First Fronde. A few years later, led by the disgruntled Louis II of Bourbon, Prince of Condé, a second Fronde ignited. A French war hero in his battles against Spain during the 30 Years' War, Louis had become disillusioned with the relative lack of respect and consideration the French monarchy had for the French aristocracy. The Second Fronde, which was much more fierce and contested, raged until 1653. By that time, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was 1 year from his coronation, and Anne and Mazarin sought to leave an immense amount of central authority to Louis. Anne and Mazarin successfully put down the Second Fronde, and in its wake, Louis XIV endeavored a monarchy of divine right and absolute power, unprecedented in French lands. Over his 72-year reign, Louis XIV worked to weaken the nobility by occupying them in his palace at Versailles, leaving matters of politics, military, and economics to him and his band of advisors. In the region between Romanov Russia and Habsburg Austria were the lands and populations of Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, Poland and Lithuania were an aligned commonwealth. Ukraine found itself in the throes of Polish-Lithuanian expansion and persecution. Many of the people of Ukraine were Orthodox Christians that had long been influenced by Muscovite and Russian culture. Many of the peoples in the Ukraine were Cossacks, rugged military elites who had been instrumental in the diffusion of Orthodox Christian culture and Russian alliance building. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a state predominantly made up of Roman Catholics, and that religious difference played out in attacks and acts of persecution against Ukrainian peoples. One Cossack leader, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, took issue with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and organized a large Cossack military to combat the actions of the Poles and Lithuanians in the middle of the 17th century. In the aftermath of Khmelnytsky's uprising, a free state of Ukrainian Cossacks would be established, and it would eventually forge an alliance with the Romanov dynasty of Russia. Looking outside of Europe, more responses to increased political centrality occurred during the early modern period. In India, the reign of Mughal dynasty was in full swing during the 17th century. Specifically, the reign of Emperor Aurangzeb brought greater control to the Mughal dynasty than any preceding Mughal emperor. Recall, Aurangzeb was notorious for his revocation of religious tolerant policies that had been set forth by Akbar the Great. He took out his aggressions on Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist populations of South Asia. He glorified the Mughal religion of Sunni Islam and reinstated the jizya tax on all non-Muslims, including the Hindu peoples south of the Deccan Plateau, known as the Marathas. In times past, the Marathas recognized the legitimacy of the Mughal Empire, and during the earlier reign of Akbar the Great, they enjoyed a level of autonomy. However, Aurangzeb's armies sought to change that lax relationship and bring the Marathas under his greater political centrality. In response, Hindu Marathas violently rebelled against Aurangzeb and the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb took great measures to put down the Marathas' rebellion, but his greatest challenge came from Tarabai, a Maratha queen who led an enormous cavalry against Aurangzeb. Her reign would outlast the reign and life of Aurangzeb, and due to her and her successors' continuous attacks against the weaker Mughal successors, the Mughal dynasty would crumble by the late 18th century. In the Americas, local resistance movements took place as encroaching colonial settlements threatened the populations and lands of Native American peoples. One example from the 16th century was the expansion of the English colony of Plymouth. Interestingly, in the Mayflower's arrival at Plymouth Rock and the first settlement of English pilgrims in the region, Native Americans such as Squanto had been responsible for introducing the settlers to food and cultivation practices. As the colony expanded and English interests matured, many surrounding Native American tribes did not trust the English expansive tendencies and plotted against Plymouth. One Native American leader, Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoag tribe, alerted the settlers at Plymouth of the other tribes' plans to pillage the colony. In the meantime, more English colonial expansion was happening in New England, as Massachusetts Bay Colony was giving rise to Rhode Island. This increased English presence did not sit well with Massasoit's heir, Metacom. Metacom, known as King Philip to the colonists of New England, started the bloodiest war between English colonists and Native Americans in the entire colonial period in 1675. Metacom's rebellion failed to halt the expansion of English colonization in North America, and his death came as a casualty of his war of resistance. However, Metacom's legacy would live on with the continued resistance movements that were led by other Native American leaders and tribes against continued English colonization over the next century. Another American example of a local resistance movement against European colonization was in the southwestern portion of North America, in the current state of New Mexico. Spanish colonization in New Spain, or current-day Mexico, had expanded northward into the lands of the Pueblo. The Spanish were known for their brutal and forceful tactics in pacifying Native Americans, and they brought those same tactics to the Pueblo. Come 1680, the Pueblo, led by Popay, enacted a revolt against further Spanish colonization and forceful Christianization in New Mexico. Ultimately, Popay's revolt succeeded in driving the Spanish from New Mexico. And though there were later attempts by the Spanish to reconquer the Pueblo lands, the Pueblo earned a degree of autonomy which left them immune to future attempts by the Spanish to forcibly spread Catholicism in the region. With the arrival of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, European colonies took the great levels of agricultural production. In the Caribbean islands, where Spanish, French, and English plantation societies were founded, large numbers of African slaves were deployed to serve their masters as coerced laborers. On the island of Hispaniola, 2 European colonies existed: the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo on the eastern half of the island, and the French colony of Saint-Dominique on the western half of the island. Named for the same Catholic patron saint, these Spanish and French colonies were really only Spanish and French in name and political and economic control. These colonies were in the tropics and were prime locations for sugar and coffee production, which brought enormous wealth and benefit to mercantilist France and Spain. However, it wasn't French and Spanish cultivators that produced on these sugar and coffee plantations, but rather large populations of African slaves. Specifically in Saint-Dominique, by 1791, the population of enslaved Africans outnumbered free French settlers by a ratio of 12 to 1. Earlier in the 18th century, Saint-Dominique was dealing with the demographic imbalance of enslaved Africans and free French settlers. It had become commonplace for plantation slaves in Saint-Dominique to flee from the plantation and take up refuge in remote parts of the island, known as Maroon communities. To the French settlers, the Maroons were fugitive slaves, but to the unfree men and women of Saint-Dominique, the Maroons were local freedom fighters. Few Maroon communities went to great extent in freeing massive amounts of fellow slaves, until the emergence of Francois Mackandal. Mackandal was a Maroon slave who had been captured in West Africa and sent to French Saint-Dominique. His escape from his plantation resulted in greater movements of resistance against French plantation owners. Mackandal was also a known practitioner of Vaudin, or black magic in the eyes of the French. He used elixirs that contained poison that he would pass on to slaves on the plantations. Those slaves would poison their plantation owners and overseers and flee the plantation for the nearby Maroon communities. Although Mackandal was captured and eventually executed by being burned to death, his influence on rebellious activity by slaves had been unprecedented, and in just a few short decades, a large slave army would start the Haitian Slave Revolt in 1791. Our last example of local resistance against greater political expansion and centrality comes from Southwest Africa in modern-day Angola. Since the end of the 15th century, the Portuguese had longed to reap the benefits of their presence in coastal West Africa, including Angola. Although Angola became the first European colony in Africa, and it did exist as a Portuguese colony well into the late 20th century, the Portuguese did not come to take Angola easily. During the 16th century, the Portuguese had begun to wear out their welcome in the region of Southwest Africa. Specifically, the Kingdom of the Congo's king, Afonso I, corresponded with the Portuguese monarch in an attempt to stop Portuguese slave raiding in the region. Afonso's pleas went on blind eyes, and the Portuguese continued to enact raids against the peoples of the Congo and those in their vassal states of Southwest Africa. One of those states was the state of Ndongo, which came under great Portuguese pressure in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Initially, Ndongo's leadership seemed incapable of resisting Portuguese encroachment. That was until the emergence of Queen Ana Nzinga, the Queen of Ndongo. Ana Nzinga was fearless as she mounted militant resistance against the Portuguese. She became such a thorn in the paw of the Portuguese governor that he requested a meeting with Ana Nzinga to discuss compromise. Ana Nzinga was greeted with Portuguese racial primacy, as she left the meeting imbued with a greater spirit of resistance. She temporarily forged an alliance with the Dutch so as to continue to resist Portuguese encroachment. In the wake of Ana Nzinga's death, the Portuguese would eventually expand their colony of Angola. but its development was halted by the actions of Anna Nzinga's resistance.